In this video, I want to talk about the biggest problem of the Ukrainian army, the problem that is causing us to lose this war, and that is the almost complete lack of long-range missiles. Ukraine is fighting a much stronger enemy, one that can strike almost any point of our territory at any moment, and it actively uses this advantage. In the very first hours of the invasion, missile strikes hit sleeping Ukrainian cities, military command centers, weapon depots, fuel storage facilities, and airfields. In the spring of 2022, the Russians destroyed all of our oil refineries, which is why Ukraine is still heavily dependent on fuel imports today. But the greatest damage came from the campaign that began in the fall of the first year of the war. The enemy focused almost all of its firepower on our power grid. At first, transformer substations were targeted. When almost nothing was left of them, the Russians moved on to destroy electricity generation itself. As you know from the news, this campaign against Ukraine's energy system achieved its goals. By spending only a few $billion on missiles and drones, the enemy caused hundreds of billions in damage to our economy, because a severe electricity shortage slowly kills economic activity. Businesses are shutting down on a massive scale because electricity prices have become impossible to afford. But the worst part is that constant blackouts caused by missile strikes are pushing people to move to the European Union, where these problems do not exist. Ukraine's demographics were already among the worst in Europe even before the war, and after several million refugees left the country, the situation has become possibly the worst in the world. I'm honestly afraid of the population census that will take place after the fighting ends, because it's very possible that Ukraine's demographic situation will turn out to be worse than that of Japan and South Korea. All of this was achieved by the Russians thanks to their complete advantage in long-range strike weapons. Over 4 years of war, thousands of missiles and tens of thousands of attack drones have been launched at Ukraine. As of early 2026, not a single thermal power plant in Ukraine remains undamaged. Some of them cannot be restored at all. Our energy system is holding on only thanks to 3 nuclear power plants and electricity imports from abroad. One of the largest cities in Europe, Kyiv, was left without electricity and heating during freezing temperatures of -20 degrees Celsius. In high-rise apartment buildings, sewage systems froze solid. There were cases where people froze to death in their own homes. At least 2 emergency workers died from exhaustion after repairing the power grid for more than 2 days without rest. Unfortunately, Ukraine cannot respond in a mirror way to Russia's missile and drone terror. If we had even rough parity in long-range strike capabilities, this war would have ended a long time ago. Their economy wouldn't have survived the kind of power outages that Ukraine has been dealing with for almost 4 years. An energy collapse would have quickly led to a broader economic collapse, and that in turn would have caused the front line to fall apart. Most importantly, causing an energy collapse in Russia would actually be easier than in Ukraine. First, their share of nuclear power is much smaller than ours, which means a much larger part of their energy system could be taken offline without the risk of nuclear accident. Second, all of Europe helped Ukraine repair its damaged energy system by sending hundreds of transformers and other critical equipment. No one would help Russia like that, especially not on such a scale and for free. Third, in Ukraine, all workers in energy sector were exempt from mobilization from the very start of the war. In Russia, on the contrary, many of them were sent to the front, which means there would be no one left to repair a damaged power grid. And fourth, their climate is much colder. Just look at this weather map from the first week of 2023. Notice how the cold front almost perfectly follows Russia's political borders. Temperatures in the European part of the country, where most of the population lives, dropped to nearly -30 degrees Celsius. Now, imagine the damage that could be done if a city of 12 million people like Moscow were left without electricity, heating, and water supply at -30. Without electricity, the economy collapses, the war quickly becomes unpopular, and the political regime becomes less stable. The last part is what the Kremlin fears the most. The only thing that was needed to end the war back in 2023 was several thousand missiles. But Ukraine didn't have them, not even close, and the West was not willing, and still is not willing, to give them to us. Because Ukraine lacks long-range weapons, this war is still going on, and it may continue for an unknown amount of time. You might be wondering, how it happened that Ukraine has almost nothing to strike deep inside Russia with, especially considering that we inherited from the Soviet Union not only nuclear weapons, but also a large number of missiles with conventional warheads. The problem started right at the beginning of independence. In the 90s, our government was made up of former communists and outright traitors who didn't understand the value of long-range weapons. As a result, some of the missiles were sold to Russia to pay off gas debts, while others were dismantled in exchange for so-called Western security guarantees. Throughout the 2000s, Ukraine massively exported almost every type of weapon it had, and corruption was almost always part of these deals. Because of this uncontrolled disarmament, we found ourselves defenseless in 2014, when the first stage of the war began. In the years that followed, the Russians carried out several acts of sabotage at our weapons depots, after which Ukraine lost the last remnants of its firepower. Because of all this, by the time the full-scale invasion began, all that remained from Soviet stockpiles were a few hundred .U missiles. They carry a warhead of almost 500 kilograms, but the range is only about 120 kilometers, which is clearly not enough to have a serious impact on the course of the war. And did Ukraine have its own missile program? Yes, it did, but it was in a very early and underdeveloped state. Both Zelensky and the previous president Poroshenko treated the missile program as something secondary. They did not believe in a full-scale war in which long-range strike weapons would play a decisive role. They were building an army only for limited fighting in the east, which meant focusing mainly on infantry and everything that supports infantry in combat. Long-range missiles were not needed for that kind of war, so the development was funded on a leftover basis. As a result, we ended up with an army that is very strong in close combat, but almost powerless at distances beyond 30 kilometers. And this came back to haunt us badly when the full-scale war did begin. The Russians knew that their rear areas were safe, and they made active use of that advantage. So, what domestic missiles did we actually have at the start of the war? The answer is pretty grim. The only weapons ready for use were just a few prototypes of the Neptune anti-ship cruise missile. On the one hand, they did their job by sinking the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the cruiser Moskva. On the other hand, the outcome of Ukraine's war is decided not at sea, but on land. To strike ground targets, the Neptune missile had to be heavily modified, which required a huge amount of effort. It still hasn't been possible to put it on large-scale production, so it's used only rarely. The situation with Ukraine's ballistic missile, known as Sapsan, turned out to be even worse. Its development started slowly back in the 2000s. The project kept stalling because of chronic underfunding and sabotage by Russian agents. In theory, we were supposed to get a modern ballistic missile with a range of 500 kilometers and a 450 kilogram warhead, essentially an analog of the Russian Iskander. But those plans were never brought into reality. By the time the war began, Ukraine didn't even have a finished prototype of its own ballistic missile. In 2022, we were forced to start developing long-range weapons from scratch. Considering how badly science and industry in Ukraine had degraded over the years of independence, this was an incredibly difficult task. Developing a missile quickly is almost impossible, so at first our engineers focused on creating a long-range kamikaze drone, similar to the Russian/Iranian Shahed. By 2023, Ukraine already had several models of such drones, but all of them had two serious flaws. The first was a very small warhead, not capable of causing serious damage. The second was that they were made mostly from imported components, with only large-scale assembly taking place inside Ukraine. However, drone development moved very fast, and by 2024, the main strike drone of Ukraine's armed forces became the Luty. It carries a 75 kg warhead, roughly the same as a HIMARS rocket, and has a range of up to 2,000 kilometers. Most often, it's used to strike oil refineries and fuel storage facilities. Most of its parts are produced in Ukraine, but complex electronics are still imported. A few months ago, a Ukrainian cruise missile called Flamingo officially entered service. Most likely, the UK helped us with its development. Its specifications are impressive. The warhead weighs more than a ton, and the flight range reaches up to 3,000 kilometers. There are downsides. The missile is large and relatively slow, which makes it easier to intercept. But there are also clear advantages. It's cheap and relatively simple, which makes it easier to produce even under constant missile strikes. The most high-profile use of Flamingo was a strike on a Russian ballistic missile manufacturing plant in the Republic of Udmurtia. The missile flew 1400 kilometers from the Ukrainian border and hit one of the factory buildings, punching a hole about 30 meters wide in its roof. This plant produces a wide range of weapons, including nuclear, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Destroying it completely would make the European continent much safer. The cost of disabling the entire facility with long-range weapons would be several times or even dozens of times lower than the cost of intercepting the weapons it produces. It's unfortunate that Europe doesn't help us carry out operations like this. Recently, the company behind Flamingo announced that it is also working on 2 Ukrainian ballistic missiles. The smaller one, called FP7, will have a warhead of up to 200 kilograms and a range of 150 kilometers. It's meant to be a cheap replacement for American ATACMS missiles. The larger one, FP9, will carry an 800 kilogram warhead and have a range of 850 kilometers. Its main purpose is to break through missile defense systems and strike targets in Moscow. Over the next few years, the company also plans to develop a low-cost system for intercepting ballistic missiles, which they see as a future component of Europe's missile defense shield. Right now, intercepting a single Russian Iskander missile costs around $6 million. The goal is to bring the cost down to about $1.5 million. The goals are very ambitious. I don't know if they can be fully achieved, but I truly hope they can. Because right now, domestic missiles are almost the only thing that can bring Ukraine peace on acceptable terms and ensure security in the future. I also hope that the West will fund our missile program, because Ukraine doesn't have the money for it now and will not have it in the foreseeable future. By the way, the European part of NATO also doesn't have enough long-range weapons of its own to deter Russians using conventional means. This needs to be fixed as soon as possible, otherwise our continent will not be able to feel safe. European countries must join forces to create their own missile program.